Have you ever chosen distance, not because someone wounded you, but because staying felt like a slow erasure of something you couldn't yet name? Have you ever stood at a gathering of people who once felt like home and realized, with no anger and no clear reason, that you were a stranger among them, that the warmth was real, but the belonging was gone? And what if that quiet grief, the one that arrives without a villain and without a wound, were not a failure of love at all, but the price of something growing in you that the old world simply could not hold? Perhaps the most disorienting losses are the ones that come from within. We have learned to grieve betrayal, abandonment, cruelty. There are words for those, rituals, a recognizable shape of pain. But there is another kind of departure that nobody names properly, the kind where you are the one who slowly steps back, not out of bitterness but out of an almost involuntary motion, the way a plant will turn toward light, even when the room it has always known is perfectly comfortable, perfectly familiar, perfectly dark. Friedrich Nietzsche spent most of his adult life thinking about this motion. Not the dramatic rupture, the slammed door, the burning bridge, but the long, invisible turning that precedes it by years. When he wrote about what he called the Übermensch, the concept was almost immediately swallowed by misreadings, bent into something about power over others, dominance, will as aggression. But if you read him more carefully, what emerges is something far more interior and far more costly. The Übermensch is not someone who overcomes others. It is someone who overcomes themselves, specifically, who overcomes the self that was assembled by other people's expectations, other people's comfort, other people's idea of what you were supposed to be. He was describing the long, lonely discipline of becoming who you were before the world named you. That phrase deserves a moment, before the world named you, because the naming began early, perhaps so early you have no memory of existing without it. You were the responsible one, the easy one, the one who kept things calm, the one who made everyone laugh, the one who never asked for too much. And you grew into those names the way a tree grows around a nail, incorporating the intrusion so completely that eventually you could not say where the tree ended and the wound began. Nietzsche's uncomfortable proposition is that the work of becoming requires a kind of undoing, not a destruction, but a careful, sometimes agonizing excavation of what you actually are beneath everything that was layered on top. The cost of that excavation is the silence where a crowd used to be. And this is what nobody warns you about. Growth, from the inside, is nearly indistinguishable from loss. You do not feel yourself expanding. You feel the space where familiar things used to be. You feel the absence of conversations that used to take up an entire evening, the absence of easy laughter that required nothing from you, the absence of belonging that was uncomplicated even when it was shallow. The expansion is real, but it is invisible to you in the moment, the way you cannot feel yourself breathing unless you deliberately stop. What you can feel is the quiet, which arrives before you have anything to fill it with, and sits there like a question you do not yet have the vocabulary to answer. Imagine a river that has flowed through the same valley for generations. The farmers depend on it. The village is named after it. Children learn to swim in it and carry the memory of that water their whole lives. Then, slowly, without announcement, without catastrophe, the river begins to change course underground. It does not dry up. It simply redirects, following some deeper gradient of the stone beneath, moving toward an opening that no map has ever marked. For years, the valley notices only the reduction. The water table drops. The fields grow thinner. The old swimming hole silences itself to mud. The village grieves what it calls the dying of the river. It does not know the river is not dying. It is arriving somewhere else. And in that somewhere else, in a valley that had been dry for 100 years, water is breaking the surface for the first time. Strange, unexpected, utterly unhoped for, the beginning of an entirely different geography. Perhaps you are that river, and perhaps what the people behind you are calling your withdrawal is not a dying at all, but a redirection toward a depth they cannot see from where they are standing. But here is what Nietzsche never quite warned you about, and what the image of the river cannot fully carry on its own. There is a shadow side to every act of detachment, and Jung would have named it immediately. Jung understood that the psyche does not simply evolve in one clean direction. Whenever we move towards something, we also move away from something else, and what we leave behind does not disappear. It descends. It becomes part of what he called the shadow, the collection of everything we have disowned, suppressed, or refused to integrate. And detachment, as luminous as it can feel in the early stages, carries its own shadow, the cold withdrawal that mistakes numbness for strength, the person who calls their emotional disappearance a spiritual achievement, the one who has learned to perform solitude without ever actually inhabiting it. Perhaps you know this shadow from the inside. There is a version of pulling away that feels like freedom, but is actually armor. It is not chosen. It is installed quietly. The first time staying close costs too much. It does not smell like growth. It smells like protection. And the difference matters enormously, because genuine solitude, the kind that Jung associated with the process of individuation, the long and often painful work of becoming a whole person rather than a convenient one. Genuine solitude requires you to remain present to yourself even in the quiet, especially in the quiet. The cold withdrawal, by contrast, empties the room and then empties the self. It confuses the absence of others with the presence of something real. The question worth sitting with is this: when you choose distance, what are you moving toward? Because there is a difference between walking away from a noise that was drowning your own voice and walking away from everything, including yourself, so that you never have to hear what your voice might finally say. Imagine a house whose windows have been shuttered for so long that the people inside have forgotten what light looked like. They tell themselves they prefer the dark, that it is quieter, safer, that the brightness used to hurt their eyes. And in a narrow sense, they are right. It did hurt, once, when they first arrived, because their eyes had not adjusted. But somewhere in the years of shuttering, the protection became the prison. The house is still intact, no one has left, and yet something essential stopped breathing inside it long ago. When someone finally reaches for the latch, not to let others in, but simply to let the light find them, the others in the house call it recklessness. They have learned to call darkness by another name. They call it peace. You are not reckless for reaching toward the latch, but you have to know whether you are opening the window or simply moving to a darker room and calling it freedom. Now let me ask you something more specific, because the river image is beautiful and the Jungian warning is true, but neither of them will touch you the way a precise question can. How many mornings did you wake up with something you wanted to make, a project, a conversation, a version of yourself, and immediately translate it into something smaller, something safer, something the people around you could hold without discomfort? How many times did you lower your voice in the middle of a sentence because you saw someone's face change and decided the rest of the thought wasn't worth the friction? How many of your ambitions are still waiting in some anteroom of yourself, exactly where you left them the day you decided it was more important to keep the peace than to keep the promise you had made to your own becoming? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are an inventory. And the total, if you are willing to count honestly, is not a measure of your weakness. It is a measure of how long you have been the river before it changed course. There is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Someone specific, the person whose presence made the lowering necessary, whose attention you bent yourself to keep. What I want you to notice is that it is probably not the first face. There was another one before, and there will be another one after, unless the pattern underneath gets named. I made a separate video about exactly that mechanism, the way we unconsciously reconstruct the same relational dynamic with different people, and why detachment alone never breaks the cycle. You will find it in the pinned first comment, or the code appearing on your screen right now. It may be the most useful thing I have put together for this channel. I will be here when you return. Now Schopenhauer. Because the temptation at this point in the reflection is to conclude that the answer is simply to want less, to thin desire until nothing can wound you. Schopenhauer would seem to invite that reading. He saw the will, that blind, insatiable drive beneath all human striving, as the root of suffering. If wanting causes pain, the logic appears to run, then wanting less must cause less pain. And there is something true in it, just enough truth to make it dangerous. But here is what that reading misses. The will Schopenhauer describes is not a dial you can turn down selectively. You cannot reduce its pull toward other people, while leaving intact its pull toward your own becoming. The same current that carried you toward belonging, toward being seen and named and held by someone else's attention, that is the identical current that, redirected, becomes the drive to know yourself deeply, to create something that did not exist before, to inhabit your own life rather than haunt it. Detachment, then, is not the quieting of desire, it is its change of address. You are not becoming someone who wants less, you are becoming someone who wants differently, and that distinction is almost everything. Imagine a craftsman who spent 20 years learning a trade he never chose, learning it because a father needed a son who would learn it, because a community had a place ready for exactly that shape of person, and the craftsman, being kind, allowed himself to be shaped. He was skilled, he was even admired, but the admiration landed on a silhouette, not on him. Then one evening, for no dramatic reason, he sat down at a different workbench and began making something no one had asked for. His hands moved in a way they recognized before his mind did. He worked in silence for 3 hours, and did not once feel the particular exhaustion that comes from performing competence. What had changed was not the quantity of effort. What had changed was its direction. The will had not been extinguished. It had finally arrived somewhere it recognized as its own. That craftsman did not hate the trade he left. He understood, with a clarity that was almost tender, that the people who had needed him in that shape had not been cruel. They had been working with what they had. They had been asking of him what they knew how to ask. And this is where understanding must replace condemnation, because condemnation is the easier thing and therefore the cheaper one. The people you are releasing, or have already released, or are afraid to release, they are not obstacles. They are something closer to mirrors. What they reflected was not a lie. It was a version of you that was real for as long as it needed to be. A self assembled carefully to fit inside a particular kind of belonging. The reflection was accurate. What changed was not them. What changed was that you grew past the frame. To condemn them for reflecting you faithfully would be like blaming a photograph for aging badly. The image was true once. The person has simply moved. Perhaps the harder thing to sit with is this. They, too, are carrying something invisible. The friend who could not follow where you were going, the partner who needed you smaller, the family that required a particular version of your voice. They are not villains inhabiting a comfortable cruelty. They are people running their own quiet war between who they are and who the world has asked them to be. They never had access to the map of your interior. They worked with what they could see, and what they could see was only what you showed them, which means, if you are honest, they were partly your collaborators in building the version of you that no longer fits. Understanding does not require you to return. It only requires you to leave without contempt. And leaving without contempt is one of the most difficult and most dignified things a person can do. Because here is the paradox, that this reflection has been circling without naming directly. The most devoted relationship of your life is not the one you lost, and it is not the one you are still searching for. It is the one you have been avoiding since before you knew there was anything to avoid. The relationship with yourself. Every reaching outward, every attempt to be held correctly by another person, every shape you assumed to be loved, every crowd you stood inside hoping it would tell you who you were, all of it was practice. Fumbling, costly, necessary practice for the relationship you have not yet allowed yourself to take seriously. Not every absence is a loss. Sometimes the silence left by a departure is the first quiet in which your own voice becomes audible. True solitude is not the absence of others, it is the presence of yourself. And so the question that remains, the one this reflection cannot answer for you, because no reflection ever truly can, is this. If you were to stop, right now, not dramatically, not with a declaration or a door slamming, but simply stop the reaching, stop the performance of being acceptable, stop the subtle daily betrayals of your own instincts, what would you find in that stillness? Not what you fear you would find, what you actually would. Perhaps they are the same thing. Perhaps the fear is the answer wearing a disguise. Carry that question somewhere quiet. Let it sit with you without demanding a response. It is not asking you to become someone else. It is asking whether you have ever truly met the person you already are. I want to say something here that feels important to say honestly, in the first person, because this reflection did not come from a distance. There was a period in my own life when I confused movement for growth. I filled every hour, every conversation, every obligation, not because these things were wrong in themselves, but because I had learned, as most of us learn, gradually and without noticing, that presence inside a crowd is an extraordinarily effective way to avoid presence inside yourself. And when circumstances strip the crowd away, not all at once, but in the slow, particular way that change actually happens, I discovered that I did not especially know how to be in the room with myself. That the silence I had been outrunning was not empty at all. It was full of things I had been meaning to attend to for years. This channel exists because of what I found in that silence. Not answers, mostly questions, but questions that felt, for the first time, honestly mine. Thank you for staying through the whole of this reflection. It matters more than the algorithm will ever be able to measure. If what has been surfacing for you during this video has a face attached to it, a specific person whose distance or absence is woven through everything we have discussed, I want to gently point you to the video linked in the pinned first comment below. It goes into the psychological mechanism behind why certain people become so central to our sense of self that their departure feels like the loss of our own ground. It is the natural next step from where this reflection leaves you. Before you go, I want to ask you to do one small, unhurried thing. In the comments beneath this video, write just this: I am allowed to become someone they didn't expect. Write it as if you mean it, even if you are not sure yet that you do, especially then. If this reflection gave you something worth keeping, a reframe, a question, a moment of recognition, consider subscribing. This channel has no interest in being everywhere at once. It shows up slowly, with care, and it will still be here when you need it, which, if the world continues being itself, will probably be soon.